Everyone who is viewing tonight's program on the ACAP community website, the ACAP Guilford Facebook page, or our YouTube channel. We are so glad to have you join us tonight. For those who may not be familiar with who ACAP is, let me take a moment. At its core, ACAP Community is an educational 501c3 nonprofit organization that offers information, resources, support, and community for those of us who are caring for aging parents. As you can tell from our name, our focus is on supporting adults as they care for their aging parents. However, all caregivers are welcome, whether you're an adult child, another relative, a friend, or professional. Each local ACAP chapter offers monthly programs that address issues related to aging, family dynamics, and adult-child caregiving. Presenters are experts on the topics they address, and many are or have been caregivers for their own parents and/or their in-laws. We now have 7 chapters across the United States. ACAP Guilford meets each month on the third Thursday at 6 p.m. We have a meeting at First Baptist Church at 1000 West Friendly Avenue in Greensboro, and virtually, as like tonight, on our Facebook page or the ACAP community website. Past programs from all of our chapters can be viewed on our YouTube channel. We have a wonderful sponsor for tonight's program. We would like to thank Griswold Home Care for their support of ACAP in Guilford County. Griswold Home Care has been serving older adults and their families for over 41 years by providing the assistance needed to allow older adults to remain at home, wherever they call home. They do this through providing personal care, homemaking, and companionship services. Griswold believes strongly in supporting families who are providing care for an aging parent by connecting them with the resources they need, resources who can provide financial support, veterans benefits, respite services, and a wide range of community programs. Thank you to Griswold Home Care for its ongoing support of ACAP Guilford. Now let's turn to our program. As we move along, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat box. The topics of our programs vary each month, often with topics that address a particular situation or need. Tonight, we'd like to take a broader look at who our aging parents are. Our topic is Aging Together, Aging for Our Future. What does aging mean? What does it look like? What is normal aging? And we are very fortunate to have experts in the field with us. Dr. Elise Eifert is an assistant professor in and graduate coordinator for the fully online gerontology program at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Dr. Chantelle S. Caro is an assistant professor in the gerontology program in the Department of Social Work, also at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Dr. Eifert and Dr. Caro, welcome.
Thank you all so much for having us this evening. As mentioned, our presentation tonight is on Aging Together, Aging for Our Future. And we're excited to be with you all and talk about one of our passions, which is aging. And more specifically today, what transitions in late life can look like for some older adults and how we can embrace those changes that come with age. For our presentation, we will be introducing or perhaps refamiliarizing for some of us the concept of the life course perspective, then building upon this holistic ideology by discussing the biopsychosocial model of health, and then weaving through and concluding with ways and strategies to enhance relationships among adult children and aging parents. So I'd like to start off with presenting to you all something to consider. And I don't mean this as a trick, but really to think about, when do you think aging starts? You know, I think some of us might say that aging starts at the moment of conception. I think others might generally say that aging begins right when we are born. But I hope that what we can all collectively agree upon is that everyone here today is aging. I like to use this as a reminder because aging can often be seen as an afterthought when it comes to our health specifically, excuse me. For many people, it is not until midlife or even late life when we begin thinking about all of those things that influence our health, lifestyle factors, our environment, how our social relationships have maybe shaped some of our decision making. One way for us to gain a better understanding of how all those factors play a role in our aging and our aging experience from infancy throughout life is to consider a life course perspective. So the life course perspective allows us to use a framework that considers all phases of life and how events, experiences, social status, demographics, so thinking about things like age, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, can all impact a person's life course. For instance, a couple of components of the life course perspective that are often identified as or that are sometimes interconnected, can be identified as transitions, which are specific points across the life course, and then turning points, which are more intense or dramatic transitions or points that are indicative of a big change in a person's life in a specific direction. Let me give you an example. A transition throughout the life course might be graduating from high school or starting your first job, while a turning point might be the death of a loved one or the death of a spouse. And I think if we really take a moment to think about it, we can think of a lot of different transitions and turning points that we've experienced throughout our life that have impacted us in a variety of ways, both positive or negative. Other things I can kind of throw out there, thinking about them, if and whether or not you've decided to marry, thinking back into our youth, thinking about puberty or that first kind of step into young adulthood, thinking about when you first were able to branch off and live on your own, whether that would be your first apartment or your first home. As we are aging, we can understand our experiences at a more micro level, so focusing on the decisions we make directly or indirectly that shape things like biology, psychological factors, social factors, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the next few slides. But we can also understand aging at a more macro level through things like historical events, culture, social, political climate. So things you can think about are experiences with war, potentially, both globally, more so globally affecting us in the United States, but certainly domestic relations as well. My family, my mother was a banker, so while I was very young, Y2K was a big issue in our household. It was a big conversation. Things like policy. So I think of what's happened most recently with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. While it was a historical movement and moment in time in the 1970s, it has now been a historical moment in the 20th century, or the 21st century, excuse me. So what I want to know here is that nowhere in the life course perspective does it say that you hit a certain age and then everything stays the same, or you pass a specific milestone and you've made it, or you haven't made it. While the visual we have here is a linear depiction of time, the life course and events we experience do not always happen in those specific stages in that linear fashion. Things can come up that might not fit that traditional mold, which means that individual agency and the support of others can really contribute to the choices that we make in our life that impact our aging experience. And then choices which impact our health in both positive and negative ways. And this is more clearly seen when we start taking a closer look at those micro level factors.
Similar to the life course perspective, the biopsychosocial model, which is shown here, is a framework that when viewed through an aging lens, adopts a holistic approach to understanding how a variety of factors can impact our aging experiences. As you can see here, changes in each factor, biological, psychological, and social, are the main factors that this examines. Each one of those factors have a relationship with each other, and they can affect each other. They are bidirectional, as you can see from those the arrows. And so in addition to these factors, you also have to look at a person's surrounding environment, the culture that they're from, the institutions that they operate within. All of this influences our aging experience. And so the biopsychosocial model allows us to see and understand these interactions in an organized way. For example, if you experience an illness or a biological complication, maybe like a fall, you may need to stay at a rehabilitation facility for care and support until you recover. And that may cause you to be isolated because you can't see the people you normally see and you do the things you normally do. And that in return may cause you to experience some sadness or depression. So we move from biological to having an impact on sociological factors, to having an impact on our psychological factors. So from this example, you can kind of see how one thing can lead to another because all of these factors are connected to each other in one way or another. Now, that example is a little bleak, and so I want to kind of flip it a little bit and tell you a different way to look at the biopsychosocial model, and that's to designate each one of these factors as capital. So in this approach, or this way of looking at the biopsychosocial model, it encourages you to really examine it because it holds a more positive perspective. So this is the one that I would prefer you to kind of utilize. I like the term capital because it allows us to think about how aging is malleable. For instance, each of us holds a level of biological, psychological, and social capital. Within biological, we can think of genes, strength, appearances, sensory functions. Within psychological capital, we can think about intelligence, emotions, personality, self-esteem, resiliency, coping. And in social capital factors, we can think about our network of relationships that we have with other people. So let me give you an example of how each of these can have a different level of capital, and how these are maybe related to each other. So for example, a person could have hit the genetic jackpot, right, and ended up with favorable genetics as it relates to things like chronic disease. Maybe they have a parent who's 100 or 105. Maybe they don't have a family history of heart disease or dementia or hypertension. And we could argue that this person has a slightly more biological capital when it comes to their physical health. The same person, however, may struggle with depression, or the ability to cope with life transitions, which then can negatively impact their mental health, thus having slightly less psychological capital. And because of their depression, the same person has difficulty keeping relationships with family or friends because they tend to isolate themselves, and this behavior leads to them maybe neglecting their body through poor nutrition and limited movement. So you can see how these factors can really are connected to each other and impact each other. And I didn't even really include anything about culture or environment. I didn't even say anything about resources. Some communities have more resources than others. Cultural backgrounds, sometimes they stigmatize certain things or certain health issues. And all of that is relevant to understanding the whole person and the whole aging experience. And so my first example is somewhat bleak. It kind of focuses on some of the negative stuff. And then the second example kind of highlights this capital and this more positive approach to aging. And so research really tells us that there's much in our control that can shape our aging experience. And while we cannot fix or change our genetics, for example, or perhaps where we live due to our income, we can still take action in other areas. We can utilize our capital in other areas, and that may directly or indirectly impact our aging in a more favorable way. Let's look more closely at each of these factors individually. There are normal changes, completely normal, whatever normal is. I hate to almost say that word because even within a quote unquote normal context, there's a lot of variation to what's normal. But there are some things that we can expect with aging in each area: biological, psychological, social. And those are the things that we can adapt to, or we can utilize capital in other areas to really balance out or function in a more favorable way. So let's look at biology. We have some changes in height that can be impacted by posture, bending of the spine, compression of disc, changes in our legs, our feet due to a decrease in joint space. Our body composition changes. We often experience some weight gain and some increase in fat, loss of muscles, and changes in hormone can impact weight as well. Our skin loses some collagen and some elasticity. We get some more wrinkles. And then our hair, my husband will tell you this, he can definitely confirm this. We have some thinning, we have some graying with age. In regards to vision, we often have some age-related diseases such as glaucoma or cataracts, macular degeneration. And then hearing, that's probably one of the most common conditions affecting older adults from a biological perspective. And it arises due to changes in our inner ear, our middle ear, but it can also be related to nerve changes from our ear to our brain. And then we'll also probably experience some taste and smell changes as well. We lose some taste, and that's natural with aging, especially after the age of 60. But other factors can kind of contribute to that, including certain medications and certain diseases. So some of it's normal, some of it's related to other factors. Now, with that being said, remember, we're thinking about our capital and the things that are within our control and the things that we can do to manage some of these natural, normal changes that are occurring. So from a biological perspective, physical activity has some of the most positive implications for the body and mind. It can be useful in preventing or delaying the onset of chronic diseases like heart disease or type 2 diabetes. It's been shown to reduce anxiety, or at least symptoms of anxiety and depression. It can prevent falls. It can improve sleep. It can also improve cognitive function. We have some really great studies going on at UNCG that are measuring a little bit of the impact of physical activity on cognitive abilities. So just kind of pause and think about it for a second about when someone like your physician or these bodies of people who know things, when they tell you to do exercise or to be physically active, kind of what's the first thing you think of? I think this actually changes over time, right? So like when we're a little bit younger, we often think of our figure, and we may want to look good for to attract a significant other. When we over the life course, that changes a little bit, where now we're starting to really focus on our health and our well-being, and more important, our longevity. So the World Health Organization actually defines physical activity as any movement produced by our muscles that expends energy. So when we say things like be more physically active, I'm not really asking anyone to run a marathon or become an avid runner or anything like that. Any movement is better than nothing. So, like, one of the things I really think about, and one of the advice that I often think about give myself and to give others, is to keep moving. You can't stop moving. Another thing I want you to kind of think about is what kinds of physical activity do you currently engage in? This is another one that can really change across the life course, where when we're younger, we may be lifting weights. And when we're older, we may want to start thinking about functional fitness. We want to be doing the things that will help us maintain our independence and help us continue to live independently. And there's a lot of things that kind of fall under that functional fitness umbrella. Most of the time, it's really low impact, a lot of strength training, which is typically light weights. It could be adapted exercises as well. So you're doing chair exercises and really working on, building strength and muscle development. And then it can come down to simple walking, 10 to 15-minute walks every day. Balance is probably a huge one that needs to be focused on. Yoga can help with that. Water aerobics, swimming is a really great low impact, age friendly activity. Stretching is a really good one as well. So these are really simple things that, like, you don't need to go to a gym per se to do. You can do them in your living room. You can do them in your bedroom. You can do them around your neighborhood. And the key part is really just keep moving. In regards to some other of the changes that go on with aging or biological changes, it's a lot about adaptation, right? And I think healthcare technology, science has helped us a lot with these types of things. With vision, we can often get larger print reading material, we can get audio tapes, we can modify the home environment in different ways to really accommodate our needs. In regards to hearing, we can also often increase the volume. We can get hearing aids and other adaptive technology. There's certain communication techniques about tone and repeating information in different ways. So it's really thinking about how we can make our environment work for us.
So next we'll move on to those psychological changes that we saw in the biopsychosocial model. And so we could explore truly a multitude of areas when it comes to a person's psychological capital. That could be a whole multiple presentations. But today we're going to focus on two areas commonly impacting the health and well-being of older adults, which is cognition, specifically focusing in on memory here, as well as mental health. So when we think about cognition, in particular memory, I just want to point out a few things that we see in the literature. So we know that, again, quote unquote normal, but we know that as we age, that we need a little more time to learn and retrieve information. So changes that we experience in our processing of information that let us know whether or not we need to store that input, store that information into our short-term or long-term memory. Another challenge kind of piggybacks off of this is remembering information that is unfamiliar to us or is meaningless perhaps is more challenging. So for example, what we're seeing here in the literature in particular with memory is that if you are presented with information or if you're having a conversation and what you're hearing doesn't seem to fit in with your daily life, doesn't seem to be something that you would experience on a normal routine, the changes that we experience in our learning and our processing of information makes it a little bit more difficult for us to identify, oh, do I really need to keep this information, or do I need to like not remember this at all? So it has a lot to do with processing and then whether that information is stored in our memory. And then another aspect in particular to memory is the concept of recognition and recall. So let me give you an example of both, and then let me talk about how that changes a bit as we age. So an example of recall would be me telling you something, or rather me showing you a list. Maybe it's a list of items. I show you this list, I take the list back, and then we have a conversation for about 10 minutes, and I ask, oh, wait, do you remember what was on my list? And I'm just asking you to now tell me. I'm not showing you the list anymore. Just tell me, do you remember? Now, recognition, on the other hand, is if I showed you that list, we had about a 10-minute conversation perhaps, and then I pull out my list again and I'm like, oh, wait, was this all that was on my list? Does anything look different here? I am giving you a cue, essentially. I'm giving you something to look at, to let me know, to recognize whether that's all that was there or not. So what we see is that as we age, recognition tends to be a little bit easier. We tend to be better at that than recall. That it's helpful for us as we get older to have some type of cue or prompt to kind of boost that part of our memory. Now, moving on to mental health, I want to focus on two areas here that we see impacting older adults. Depression first. Depression is the most common mood disorder among older adults. Depression, it's not that you hit 65 and now you're depressed, right? Depression could be a mental health condition that you experience early on in life, right? In particular, if it's diagnosed depression, right? Differentiating slightly between depressive symptoms and clinical diagnosis of depression. Depression also can be something that does impact us, late onset depression or late life depression, and that could be associated with chronic conditions, right? It can be associated with changes in our hormones. It can be associated with changes in medication we might be taking. So we might see changes that perhaps spark those depressive symptoms as we get older. Anxiety, slightly different, at least when we see in the literature. As it stands right now, anxiety, general anxiety disorder, some researchers are suggesting that this is an underdiagnosed condition among older adults. Anxiety itself typically presents in young or midlife. So what some researchers are suggesting is that maybe one of the reasons, right, it could be that there's a lot of older adults with generalized anxiety disorder that are just not talking about their symptoms. It could also be that there are people in their young and midlife who have had anxiety, who have never reached out to a physician, and who have just managed to, what I like to talk to my mom about is cope enough with life stressors. They've been able to manage enough events in their life. And so that they're not claiming, or they're not seeking out any medical attention or therapeutic intervention for anxiety as they are older, because they've done a fairly decent job of managing enough as they've aged. So in thinking about those two areas, we're talking about capital. How do we build our psychological capital to address, or to cope with, maybe cope's not a good word, adapt with these changes as we age, right? So one of the ways we can do this in memory, Elise already mentioned it, rehearsal. So things like repeating information. I know I do this quite a bit, is if I'm introduced to someone, they say their name, I say hello and their name back, right? I, for some reason, really good with last names, terrible with first names, so trying to practice that rehearsal. If you can't write it down, repeating somebody's number, if they give you their number, to repeat that number until you get a chance to jot it down. Another way to do this is mentally picturing information. So an example I have for this one is when I'm actually writing a list, which is another option here, is written notes. Let's say a grocery list in particular, I try to mentally picture where in the grocery store I am seeking those items. So like if I'm first walking into Harris Teeter, I know I'm going produce first, and then kind of going around to meats, and then where in the aisles do I typically go? So as I'm writing my list, I'm trying to mentally picture where all those things are. A caveat to all of these strategies that I do think are really great tools for building our psychological capital is one of the issues that older adults may face is that if we don't continue to practice these strategies, they never become familiar to us, right? So they stay unfamiliar, they stay kind of uncomfortable. So it's really one of those things like, okay, now we've heard them, now we've recognized them. How do we kind of try to continue to practice this? How do we help the older adults in our lives practice this? Maybe modeling some of that behavior to make this feel a little bit more familiar so we can really benefit from these strategies. Thinking about mental health, I want us to think about our ability to cope with stressors, to maintain relationships, to respond to certain events, maybe even crisis events. We've talked a little bit about physical activity and the benefits we get from physical activity for our mental health. But I really like this visual because I think it gives us a way to conceptualize or at least visualize different areas that can impact our mental health and then help us think about how can we address each of those areas. What level of capital do we have, or how can we foster greater improvement in some of those areas? So I'm going to point out a couple of here and not try to kind of repeat anything we've already touched upon, but like our brain and a healthy diet. So what can we do in the community, for example, utilizing our resources, taking advantage of nutrition classes offered through senior centers or your local library, things like brain games, so the crossword in the newspaper or the word search. There's a lot of really cool technological tools and apps now. For instance, I have a professor, a mentor that I used to work with who's created research-based brain games with Brain HQ and Posit Science that has, it is a monthly fee, but you have these games that you can do if you are really into being on your app, or if you know your parent is really into being on the tablet. These are great ways to kind of stimulate your brain while you're on the app or on like a tablet or something like that. Quality sleep. So when we're thinking about stress, sleep is a great way to kind of combat some of that stress you've built up during the day, giving your body kind of a reset. But how do we get quality sleep? So thinking about things like removing distractions from your room at night. I know my neighbor has like 3, what are those things? Sound machines. She has like 3 sound machines and a fan. Needs complete kind of like ambient noise to get a really good night's rest. We're going to talk a little bit more about social capital in the next few slides here, but I want to touch on it just briefly in thinking about meaning and purpose. So as an older adult, you know, with the transitions we experience, remembering talking about that life course perspective, one of the major transitions, I would argue, turning points is retirement, if you are able, or a switching of careers, and what that might do or how that might impact your feeling of purpose. Another one might be for people who have children. What does that do? And particularly we see this with a lot of the research with women, when you're no longer that primary nurturing role for children or young people that you've taken on that nurturing role for, whether they're your children or not. Do you lose a sense of purpose? So how can we regain that? How can we become a part of our community or see what opportunities we have that we can kind of enact out our passion? So volunteering is something very big in the literature. Certainly you've heard of likely the foster grandparent programs. So those are some ideas when we're thinking about purpose. And we've already talked about some of the others, so I'm not going to try to repeat. All right.
The last factor, the last area that we're going to look at is the social changes. Our relationships change throughout the life course. In childhood and in adolescence, we tend to have closer relationships to our parents and our primary caregivers. As we get a little bit older, young adulthood, we begin to break away from our parents and we seek independence and our own identity. And we often do that through our peers and our friendships. And then in adulthood, we start building our own families. And so attention is often given to our spouse or our partner, and then often our children. And then in older adulthood, friendships take on, again, a different role as maybe connections to different generations with our grandchildren. And we may experience a loss of some of our friendships over time, not just in older adulthood, but over the life course as well. We move, we change jobs, and that can create fractures in our relationships, or some friendships fade away. Now, there are all different types of social support that kind of come from our relationships. So we can receive things like informational support, like we seek advice or we share information and experiences. We often get emotional support from our relationships, and that can be physical comfort. It can be listening to one another. And then we also get instrumental support. So that can be things more physical, with assistance with like our ADLs or just our life in general. And family is really the primary source of support. And it typically takes on a kind of a more informal role, because we often have this lifetime or many years of relationships, and things are unspoken because you know each other so well, or you're comfortable with each other. And then as we age, friendships often have this stronger role, or they start to take on a very strong role in the lives of older adults, because it's by choice. Relationships with our friends are usually voluntary. They're reciprocal. Kind of what's the saying? You can't choose your family. You're stuck with who you get with your family, but your friends, you can really choose who to include in your life. And those relationships can be really valuable, really influential, and really important. They can serve as confidants. They can provide companionship, particularly in the face of loss. For some older adults, we may experience widowhood, or we may just have family that has moved away across the country, and so they may not have that presence that they did previously, and our friendships can kind of fill in that role. Perhaps more importantly, one of the things that I find most interesting about relationships as we get older is quality matters. As we age, the number of people within our social network decreases, but the quality of those relationships are actually much higher than when we were younger and at different points in our of our lives. So the amount, think about teenagers. Like, teenagers want to have hundreds of friends, right? But as we get older, that's not as important. We'd rather have one really good friend than 10 okay average friends. So the amount and the type of positive support that we receive from people in our networks is really more likely to kind of benefit our mental and physical health, because that emphasis on quality is really there. So how can we really capitalize on relationships, right? Social networks, peer relationships, they're meant to foster trust and reciprocalness. A lot of research has been shown to to show that relationships decrease mortality. They have an impact on management of stress. They lower levels of depression, and even some of the biological factors, like they lower blood pressure. So you start to see that biopsychosocial approach kind of looking at that. They foster a lot of positivity as well. Sometimes we may think that, well, I visited mom or dad every Sunday or 3 times a week. However, we know that quality is more impactful. So it's not about whether we visited with our peers or whether we had relationships with how often we saw our relationships. If we had one quality interaction once a week, then that can really last us for a very long time. So again, we're not emphasizing the number of relationships, but we should really be focusing on that quality of that relationship and the quality of time that we spend with other people. One of the things we can really do is strengthen existing ties with non-family members. I mentioned earlier that, friendships kind of change, relationships change over time. And sometimes people come in and out of our lives. And one of the things that we can really do as we get older is to, make sure that we're not losing some of those relationships or reconnecting with some relationships that we may have let go to the wayside, and allow those relationships to really provide emotional support, to help people with problem solving, to share information with services, word of mouth and help like that. And who could this be, right? It could be someone we know, but it could also be neighbors, people that we occasionally see, or maybe we consider acquaintances. But it can also be more formal supports, like Meals on Wheels is a great source of social interaction. It's not just providing food, it's also connecting other people and allowing conversations to occur between other people. And then one of my favorite things is intergenerational programs, allowing opportunities to have older people and younger people interact and do things together. It allows for a lot of meaningful connections. Often it can be a way of transferring wisdom, and a lot of times it's just fun. It's joyful, right? We forget. I can't remember the number, but it's something like children under the age of 5 laugh hundreds of times per day, and by the time we're 20, we laugh like once a day or something like that. So it's like really sad to think about how we lose some of that joy when we age, and being able to be around children and people who are younger than us can really bring that joy and lightheartedness back to us. And so that can be a form of social capital that we can really utilize. So just think before we move on how you would want to foster healthy, positive social relationships in your life as you age right now. What can you set up? What kind of capital can you utilize to make sure that as you age, you're doing it in a really strong way?
So before we wrap up, given all of you here, or at least many of you here, are in some way caregiving or have been caregivers or continuing to caregive with older parents, we wanted to think about some of the ways that we can come together, some of the ways that we can, or strategies that we can share with you to make those connections, to find a way to meet each other where we're at in our aging process. Because older adult makes it seem so that they're the only person that's aging, but you're also aging, right? So remembering that aging is inevitable, that we're all going through it, that your parents were where you are at one point in time, and you will be hopefully where they are at one point in time. So I want you all to consider and think about, and so I don't want to presume yet, but think about ways that you have been presented with challenges in your relationship with your parents as you are both getting older. Certainly this could be around caregiving, but could it also be the way that you've tried to connect, how your relationship has changed, how you may interact now, or how that's kind of changed throughout your life with your parents. So to acknowledge that we'll all face challenges, we'll all face obstacles in our relationships, in particular our relationships with our parents. And what some of the literature shows, and honestly quite a lot of this, there is some in the gerontological literature, but as gerontology is an interdisciplinary field or multidisciplinary, depending on your perspective, a lot of this pulls from psychology as well. But literature shows that authority between parent-child relationships can be a challenge as we get older, as we think about aging. This perceived power shift, and then perceptions of stubbornness in either direction, right? Whether that be the adult child or the older parent. So some of the ways to face challenges, I'm going to give a couple examples of some of these in this kind of chart. Practicing empathy, kind of already touched upon this, but really trying to take a moment to be self-aware, to put yourself in others' shoes, to imagine how your older parent might feel with the transitions that they are facing. Right now that you know all this information about capital and how this impacts our health, to really think about, oh wait, that might be a really interesting experience, or that might be a really challenging experience. I think of this as my father had a lot of issues when he started to face limitations in his physical ability due to illness. And I initially felt really upset and hurt by the way that he would speak to me at times. He at times was very curt with me, and that was completely out of his nature. And I had to really think about it and not get so kind of wrapped up in my own emotion that my relationship now has changed because he's changing and he's experiencing things that he doesn't have control over and I don't have control over. So to really kind of step away from my feelings and really kind of empathize with, this is who he thought who he was for so much of his life, and that's changing now. And how can I meet in a middle place with him so that, you know, we can have a really positive relationship. Another thing that I thought was really poignant, and I think we hear a lot, in particular around caregiving at times, is addressing concerns through support and not questioning of choices or behaviors. So I tried to think of a really good example here. I'm not sure how successful I was, but I'm going to give it to you. So maybe you're concerned that mom has a new hobby, and that hobby particularly seems to be triggering her sciatica, focusing kind of on physical stuff, right? Fair point. I'm using my mother as an example. Instead of questioning why she continues to do the hobby that does bring her joy, find a way to support her in continuing to explore her passion, but helping her so that she potentially isn't triggering that physical discomfort. So instead of saying, why do you keep doing that if you keep getting sciatica issues or flaring up your sciatica, maybe saying, oh, hey, every time you show me your project, you're ending with, oh, I'm in so much pain and I can't work the rest of the week, or I can't move the rest of the week. Would it be helpful if we maybe got you a stool, something to lean on, maybe a cushion? And right, so now I'm not questioning why you want to keep on doing this, but I'm saying, great, your project sounds great. I also don't want you to be in pain. Is there any way that I can help support you, continue to do your activity, and we can meet in a middle ground here? Another one I want to think about, that because we're here and because this is out in our community, is thinking about outside resources as a tool. Outside resources to support your relationship with your parent. So I'm going to give another personal example to my life, to my family. and that's finances. And I think a lot of people can relate to finances and contention over finances. So let's say you're in a relationship and you're seeing that your parent is having some issues with finances, or maybe it's just your concern for whatever reason, right? But bringing up finances and having a talk about finances is always starting an argument, is always starting an issue. Going out into your community and finding a financial advisor, finding a professional to help steer the conversation or act as a mediator or even a liaison to that conversation. So now it is not you as adult child trying to disrupt the power shift, trying to take over or trying to remove autonomy. It is now this professional saying, here is my advice. And then you all can connect. Oh yeah, he was kind of harsh, or I'm not sure. Maybe we should seek out other advice. I don't know. And so this way we're talking about it. We're getting that conversation going. And maybe we can build some type of camaraderie or some type of mutual understanding around issues that can be really impactful and really important to our daily lives. So those are a couple. I'm certain if you had any other thoughts with any of the other little boxes, we could totally talk about those at the end of our presentation, which we're coming up on actually. This is probably a terrible transition, but hopefully not. I just want to thank you all. We would like to thank you all for having us here this evening and hoping that we can continue this conversation in any way you see fit. We have both of our contact information here on the slide. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eifert and Dr. Caro. You have given us a great deal to think about, both in terms of what normal aging looks like, and then some of the actually many things that we can do to stay as healthy and active and happy about moving into our older years. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I would also like to thank again our sponsor, Griswold Home Care, and remind everybody that our program next month will be on Thursday, March 16th at 6 o'clock. We're going to be talking about making the transition from hospital to home. You know, what do we need to know when somebody leaves the hospital? How do we support somebody after a hospitalization? Janet Canode, who is a social worker with Jewish Family Services of Greensboro, will be speaking with us then. If you would like to be notified about our upcoming programs, and we would like to notify you, please like us on our Facebook page at ACAP Guilford, or register for any upcoming program on our website at ACAP Community. Thank you so much for being here with us, and we look forward to seeing you next month.